Hi there, my name is Joshua Burrows and this is my video walkthrough of how I made my treasure chest. To start this off, I just wanted to show the PureF board that I used throughout developing the treasure chest, just because this isn't really seen throughout many of the clips, only brief glimpses of it. With the treasure chest, I took a little bit of a different approach when it came down to the look, because this is mainly inspired by post-apocalyptic settings like Mad Max and Fallout. I would also like to apologize with how long this video is, because I was having some issues with the software where when I would sometimes scale it down with the videos, it would sometimes delete bits of it. So this was roughly the length that I could get it all to work with. So I'll try and have some timestamps in the description just to help guide towards some parts that have a voiceover with it, because not all of this has a voiceover. And with all of that said, I hope you enjoy the walkthrough. To begin development on the project, I decided to make some rough blockouts of each piece that I wanted to include in the scene with the chest. When I was doing this, I imported a scale reference that was about 6 feet tall, so I have an idea on the scale of each piece so nothing looks disproportionate to each other. To help add some shape to some of the blockout objects, I'll usually add edge loops as well as some bevels, and every so often start extruding some of the faces just to make them look a little bit more unique to each other so I can understand which ones are which, so they're not just all very blocky or just made up of a cube. In the beginning stage, I will usually try and group each of these separate blockout pieces. So then it's just an easy selection process when I just want to have them soloed and just focus more on them. So depending on the model, I will sometimes use the symmetry tool quite often, because with quite a lot of the hard surface stuff that I've done before, it's usually just a reflection on the other side, but it also depends on what kind of state I want it to be in. So if I wanted something a little bit more destroyed, then I'll probably start off with symmetry or using the mirror tool and then later on just distort it. But most of this, it was just using symmetry and then every so often mirror when I've either forgotten, well, mainly just forgetting to turn on the symmetry feature. When developing some of the objects, I will change the positioning of the axes when manipulating the faces, edges, or the vertices, because this can sometimes help with just the angling of some of the positions, but also make the proportions look a bit more correct. Something I find myself doing in this project was using CV curves a few times for some of the pieces. So this was mainly with the hook as well as the rope used around the chest. With this, I would either use one of the preset CV curves like the circle or create my own curve just to get that shape. And then I would use the sweep tool that was added to my about a year or two ago just to help fill that all in, because the old way was just getting a face, pulling out the end, and then just doing extrude. But with this one, it using sweep, it makes it a little bit more usable as well as customizable, since you can later on, if needed, put in your own custom mesh with it. And I've always found this quite useful when they added it in, as well as being able to manipulate the curve so that the sweep mesh actually changes with it was also quite handy. My workflow when making hard surface models is to usually start low poly, then work up to high poly. This just helps me with making some of the shapes to them, but it can vary depending on what kind of model I'm making. So if it's something stylized, we'll be making a rough block out of it, then importing it to software work and sculpting, like ZBrush, and then just bring it back and retopologize it. But with this project, it was just mainly making the low poly, then adding bevels to some of the parts with it. But this can range because with the chest, I did start with adding a lot of edge loops as well as just extruding inward and just bevels with that. Throughout when I was using like the CV curve tools, I did also use soft select for parts of it. This was mainly to affect the control vertices because it made it move in more of a natural way, well, morph with it. And I also used this for the scrap metal for the same reason, just with the way it made the shape go quite nicely. To render the treasure chest in, I decided to use Unreal because I'm quite familiar with that software and just find it quite easy just to set up the lighting as well as the cameras for it. When getting Unreal set up, I later on imported one of the materials that I use in quite a lot of my projects because this master material is a basic material, but it can be adapted later on just to be more useful. So with my project, I added a temporal differ AA, I believe it's called the function for the floor because this helped get the actual fade off look because it wasn't working with the normal masks that I use. I also added in a exponential height fog into the scene as well, because I like to use this quite a lot with the lighting that I do in my scenes. I find that it makes it add a bit more cinematic look and makes it seem a bit more atmospheric. So with the lights that I've currently got on the scene, the one that's just above the treasure chest is a stationary light. So that light can still affect the fog, which the treasure chest, so it just pops out a bit more as well as with some of the other props. When making the pipes that would just support the chest underneath, I decided to use a Boolean to just try and help them look a little bit more like spikes. I did this because on the inside of the pipe I had extruded inwards so that it would have like a little bit of thickness, and with the Boolean I decided to try and make that a little bit more visible. And I think it helps also bring a little bit of a different shape to some of the areas around it. Another thing to add when it comes to the UVing, I prefer to UV each piece of the model separately before combining it all, because I find that this has a little bit of a better control on where issues are. So if you combined it all and then just did an unfold and said non-manifold, it'd take a while to find it. Whereas if you do it each piece separately, you can at least find the issue first before having to go back and forth with it all. Them was just using, I believe it's the planar feature with it, where it would just flatten it all out and then I'd start unfolding, because with the more curved objects like the tires and the rope, this worked quite well as manually straightening the UV shell, but also using the straighten every so often just to help out with that. When it comes to the light map and generally with the normal UV itself, I use the two different layouts with it because you've got layout unfolded and then I believe it's layout 3D. I mainly use 3D for the light map itself because I find that has a little bit better control just with the spacing as well as some of the proportions. Something else I would also do, depending on the model, would be something I'd call offsetting. At least I believe that's what it's called. Where you take two UV shells that are practically the exact same, flip one of them, and then offset them off of the UV sheet to the exact position it would be on the other side. This is so that you can save a little bit of space with it and just get more detail on the texture itself. But also with this, it doesn't affect anything with the baking, stuff like that. But this would obviously change when it comes to the light map. Whenever I'm about to start texturing with some of the models, I will usually make a copy of the final model and then start separating bits and pieces for it for Substance Painter. This is mainly to try and avoid some artifacts whenever I'm baking, because sometimes if some of the pieces are too close together, then it will just leave an artifact and not look right. Whereas if they're separated, they will just bake quite fine. And then I will usually copy a third version but offset all the UVs so it doesn't get affected by the baking, but also I can have a better grasp on what the final look of it will be when it's all back together. Whenever I'm setting up the models inside of Substance, I will usually make a few different folders and have some fill layers in there. So then I can just distinguish between what bits need to be done. And then in those folders, I apply masks onto certain parts of the objects because with most of them, they will be made up of some different materials. Whenever I'm using smart materials with my models, I'll generally use some of the pre-made ones or just the general materials, or I'll use some custom ones I've been making over the years. So with this project, I got the opportunity to use a rust material that I've been making. This rust material is a little bit different from the other materials I've made in the past because this one utilizes anchor points quite a bit because with a lot of the different features of the rust, they're just separate fill layers that come back to the first one. And most of this is affected by a paintbrush, but also a filter that has position on it. So whenever you're painting on these surfaces, it gets the position and makes it go downwards, but this can always be altered with how far it can go down or when it cuts off, as well as just like specific colors and where butts pop up. The nice thing about the paint layer on the rust material is that it can use any of the different paintbrush presets that are already in Substance Painter, so I can get a wide range of different effects on different surfaces if I wanted it a bit more intense or subtle in specific areas. I also added this big black plane to the background of it. This was because I was just having a few issues with the background because it would always come up as a blue or pick up the lighting for some reason on the box. Something I tried to do throughout development but ended up doing more near the end was taking screenshots of the scene itself, then bringing it into a different software to turn down the resolution or pixelize it. This is mainly done because just to see what colors pop out the most, because I want to try and attract the eye towards the chest more than anything. But what I first found out was that the crane was taking up more of that attention because of just how bright the red was. So I did change up a few of the colors with the chest to try and make it pop out a bit more. In the end, I changed the chest to a bit more of a brighter blue to get it to pop out more, but also made the red look a little bit more faded on the crane and darkened the floor to make it just all come together. Thank you for your attention with this and hope you enjoyed the video.